Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Philosophizing In, the interview series about philosophy in lesser studied languages. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Professor Hala Kim about philosophy in Korean. Now, I wanted to begin, Professor Kim, by asking you a question that really struck me when I was reading through some of your work on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on philosophy in Korean. One of the things that really struck me about that was the sort of two tendencies towards Korean philosophy being this incredibly international, incredibly translinguistic sort of tradition, one which interacts with so many of the other interesting currents of East Asian philosophy from sort of, Indian Buddhism to Japanese Zen and Chinese Confucianism. And then on the other hand, some of the incredibly unique and unusual aspects in some way of Korean philosophy. And I suppose the first question I wanted to ask you is whether you can locate some of these unique aspects of Korean philosophy in the uniqueness of the Korean language. I think it's our first language isolate that we've been studying on this series. So, yeah, whether the language is sort of some of the source of the uniqueness of Korean philosophy, and whether there's anything in particular about the Korean language which can either serve as a challenge or an advantage for doing philosophy in Korean.
Yes, Korean philosophy first developed with interaction with neighboring countries, including China and by way of India. Obviously, Buddhism arose originally in India. But yes, Korean language is unique, as you point out. It's not related to Chinese at all, even though Korean traditional philosophy was under the influence of Chinese philosophy. Obviously, because Koreans made extensive use of Sino-Korean language, namely classical Chinese language. In terms of the philosophy, abstract thinking in the Korean peninsula, it was important due to the influence of the by the Chinese by way of Confucianism and Sinicized Buddhism and Taoism. So the heavy philosophical terms were all expressed through classical Chinese concepts or terms. But in the middle of this important development, or rather transformation of the Korean spirituality from the concrete thinking manifested in native shamanism, we still retain the original form of thought patterns or structural habits in thinking. For example, Korean has a term for heavenly authority. We call it Hanu. It is naturally developed into a god of heaven, or Chunjin as we speak. And then this one is well preserved in the Korean tradition, and then even incorporated into the formation, the nation formation myth, the myth of the national origin and stuff like that. We call the original ancestor god Tangun, and that means heavenly god. So there's a tradition of the worship of heaven in Korea that is very distinctive in the Korean thinking, and then that has been actively incorporated into Korean thinking even after they imported Buddhism and Confucianism into the peninsula as well. So, for example, during the medieval kingdom of Korea, the heavenly worship has been incorporated into Buddhism, and so as well as the Confucian state of Joseon, later kingdom. People sometimes express their view about the heaven in terms of the Confucian language. For example, this is a trend that you can find it among Korean neo-Confucians. So, and also modern Korean philosophical thinking, very strongly influenced by this kind of mentality or spirituality.
Excellent. So So it kind of like I think the word you used there that I picked up on was foundation, right? So it's kind of some of the basic worldview, the basic sort of outlook in the way that kind of, a particular tendency of thought that can then be expressed in all of these different subsequent developments of Korean philosophy.
Yes, it's basically a form of nature worship, that everything in nature is holy and sacred, that we should not mess with it, that the nature is governed by this uh, supernatural beings. And we are natural beings. So there should be a medium between us natural beings and the supernatural beings, or God, so to speak. And then this is mediated by what we call shaman or mu in Korean. So shaman is a kind of medium between the ordinary world of natural things and the supernatural world of gods. And they perform rituals uh, uh, and other activities, communal activities to mediate these two different worlds, to bring us uh, happiness and even healing. That um, was the uh, how shamanism played a big role in the Korean society. One thing that is important is that this kind of nature worship uh, has been well preserved in our conception of nature. Um, in the field of aesthetics, for example, Korean art, Korean architecture, Korean music all try to conform with the rhythm of nature, and then they try to minimize way that we humans interfere with nature minimally, if possible. So, Korean garden, for example, tries to conform with the natural environment as much as possible, unlike other forms of architecture. Um, for example, in contrast with Japanese landscape art of landscaping, Korean gardens are uh, natural reflection of the beauty um, around people. There's a minimal uh, uh, mm, the manipulation of natural environment in the way that you see in other forms of culture. Nature worship is a basic philosophy, or the foundation for philosophy in the Korean tradition. And also that is also reflected in the Korean language and also culture. That's how I see the relation between shamanistic pre-philosophical background and full-fledged philosophical abstract thinking in Korea, which developed later. And what kind of gods? What includes heavenly god, but the most important one is mountain god. Korea is a very mountainous country, so they revere nature, yeah, by revering the mountain god. So whenever you visit shaman temples in Korea, you see the image of mountain god, and that's uh, that's the main deity that the shamans revere. And then they resort to a prayer and dance and songs and the rituals, so that we can send off the dead ones peacefully, and also bring about the happiness and uh, satisfaction of the worldly needs, and many other things.
Yeah, this is the mountain god which is depicted with the old man with the beard and the dragon at his feet.
That's right. That's right.
Not the dragon, the tiger, sorry. Yes,
That's
yes,
right.
yes.
Tiger. That's right.
Brilliant.
Tiger.
So I wanted to now sort of talk about how some of those foundational, that kind of bedrock of Korean philosophy begins to be expressed in contact with some of the great, worldwide, global philosophical traditions. Um, and maybe we could begin with Buddhism. This is going to be one of the overlaps with many of the other languages that we've discussed. And you mention one of the sort of particularly important figures in this sort of early development of Buddhist thought in Korea is Wonyo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's correct. Correct pronunciation. Wonhyo. Yes, right.
And you mentioned him as being sort of perhaps the first great philosopher of Korean Buddhism. So could you just tell us maybe a bit about Huinyo and why his ideas are so important?
That's right. That's a very sensible question. By the way, Wonhyo was a citizen of the kingdom of Shilla, an ancient kingdom in the Korean peninsula, who and they accepted Buddhism only 90 years earlier. So Buddhism was a new religious and philosophical movement in the kingdom of Silla. Um, Yet he came up with the most elaborate and uh, sophisticated system of Buddhist metaphysics. So that's the important. And then when you visit Korea, there are so many Buddhist temples named after him. Wonyosa Temple, Wonyosa Temple here, Wonyo Road here, Wonyo Road. So you can see that he's a kind of a national hero. But what's the philosophical import of his thought? He's, you know, if you take a look at the great systems of thought in the world, I don't know, it's Islam takes Quran as their major sacred book, and Christianity takes the Bible as a major text, and the same with Judaism and other major spiritual movement as well. But in Buddhism, there is no one single text or sutra. Yeah, they um, um, found in many different sutras. So when Buddhism was first imported into Korea, people were confused. This sutra says this, this Buddhist text says this, others say different things. What should I follow? People ask themselves. So Buddhism came with a different, seemingly different strain of thoughts. Wonyo's genius was to conceive this different, seemingly different strains of thought into one harmonious whole, with a focus on what he calls the uh, one mind, ilshim in Korea. And then, for example, if I may pick two major uh, competing theories within Buddhism. It's called the School of Emptiness, most uh, um, distinctively expressed by the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna's view, School of Emptiness, or middle, we call it middle school. The view is that everything is empty, empty of self nature, no fixed nature, no independent existence. That's the Nagarjuna's philosophy, and that's imported from India via China, and then finally settled in Korea. That's a major school. Another major school was consciousness only school, namely that the whole phenomena world is an expression of uh, the human consciousness. So that's why it's called consciousness only school. There are two competing schools. Wanyo's genius was to combine and synthesize these two trends of thought, and then come up with a all-encompassing system of thought under the idea, under the leading idea of one mind. So one mind can be viewed as comprehend these two different diverse elements. So the phenomenal world may be an expression of our consciousness, especially the storehouse consciousness, which is a kind of CPU um, um, in humanity, and then but underlying this phenomenal world lies uh, the true reality called emptiness or nothingness. So when you was able to come up with the harmonious whole, um, mm, including everything. So sometimes he's called the national master of harmonization.
Excellent. So his primary importance is, from what you said, I suppose, synthesizing so many of these different seemingly contradictory aspects of the Buddhist tradition as it had come to Korea. And it's fascinating that you're saying that he's doing this at such an early stage in the development of Buddhism in Korea. It's not at the end of a very long process of contradictions and different ideas, as some of the sort of eclectic philosophers of the Greek world might have done, almost 1,000 years into the tradition. He's immediately sort of seized on this question and tried to sort of think about how it all fits together. And I was fascinated by something you wrote where you said that it's not only the Buddhist ideas that he's interested in synthesizing and putting together, but he also pays attention to some other East Asian philosophy of that sort of era, that he engages with Taoists, that he engages with the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi.
That's right. That's right. He was uh, advanced in his studies enough to be able to be generous and be able to
Mhm.
accommodate different trends of thought, including
Mm,
non-Buddhist ideas such as Taoism. Taoism represented by Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. And he sometimes used the term Tao uh,
mhm,
to describe the Buddhist reality of nothingness, and also, and naming that reality is ineffable. I mean, that's the idea. And also,
mm,
uh, Chuangzi's uh, eponymous work, Chuangzi, namely that the
mhm,
opening chapter is sometimes on the equality or unity of all things. And you see that
mhm,
according to Wonyo's scheme that I elaborated earlier, uh, the different levels of reality are uh, systematized and unified uh, by means of the fundamental concept of one mind. And then in one mind, um, you see the equality among different things, including the emptiness and the consciousness, and so on and so forth. So that's how he was able to use the language of Taoism to express his mature Buddhist thought. So he tried to pay tribute, pay respect to the other uh, forms of thought without abandoning the fundamental tenets of Buddhism. That's what his genius consists in, I think.
Well, that's fascinating because I wonder whether we can use that as either a parallel or a comparison case with another thinker. I'd like to move us forward many hundreds of years. We can come back to any earlier points if you're interested in, but to compare that with somebody who's perhaps the central figure in the history of Korean philosophy, Jinul.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering, how does he compare to Juanyo as a sort of religious, as a philosophical figure, and what his role is in the establishment of what you mentioned earlier is Zon, or better known as Zen philosophy.
Yes, yes, yes. You said it right. The Son or Zen,
Mm,
which means meditation. So it's a kind of meditation Buddhism,
hmm
direct insight into the reality of the mind and the universe. So you see, there is a emphasis on the direct grasp of uh, the cosmic reality on the part of Chinul, uh, the Sun master, Zen master in the medieval kingdom of Korea. This is about the 11th century, right before the Mongol invasion. The his contribution was a tireless reformation of the existing Buddhist order. At the time he was active, Buddhism was established ideology in the medieval Korean kingdom, and naturally
hmm
you see a lot of corruptions and degeneration, both in theory and practice. So uh, Chinul noticed that and then determined to reform the Korean uh, Buddhist uh,
mm
order. So you can compare him to, I don't know, Martin Luther in Germany. So he was a tireless reformer. What was his basic intuition? Well, his view is that the study of Buddhist sutras, which is called Kyo or doctrinal studies, is completely compatible with sitting meditation, namely Zen or Son in Korean. So, mm, after all, it's Buddhism. So we are talking about the view of Buddha, but Buddha's word can be uh, compared to the doctrine or doctrinal studies, and Buddha's mind can be compared to the
Mhm.
sun or the meditation. So Buddha's position can be expressed either by way of Kyo or the doctrinal studies or the meditational aspects. So these are not two things. The essence of Chinese Buddhism is the maintenance or emphasis on non-duality, non-duality of these two things. Reality is non-dual. Reality is one, and it's a question of the the one uniform
Mhm.
reality, and then doctrinal study, and on the one hand, meditation, not binary operation, but it's
Mm.
two different expression of one of the same reality, which he happens to call Buddha nature, the underlying nature in human beings.
Okay, fantastic. That's raised many, many questions, but I suppose we'll try and keep focused with just one quick comment and then a question. The first one is I found it fascinating that you compared his role historically to Luther, especially given that his interest, by the sound of things, was moving away from some of the technicalities of doctrinal disputes and towards a more direct access to what the ultimate religious truth was, in the sense that, we don't need all of these theological quibblings. We can focus on the meditation, which is at the core of our activity. The question I had for you, though, was more on what you were saying about this idea of, Buddha mind or Buddha nature as being the one underlying unity to all things, because this is a theme that's come up a couple of times. Do you think this is a sort of one of those general tendencies and ideas that we can trace back to very early Korean shamanic ideas? This idea of a unity or a tendency towards monism?
That's right. That's right. I certainly think that he is a fundamentally Buddhist in that regard, and then uh, what we call the um, phenomena world and the underlying real world are not two but one. And then in that regard, he agrees with earlier Wonhyo. But the interesting thing is that despite his emphasis on the meditational aspect of philosophical activity or spiritual life, he doesn't denounce the careful study of sutras at all. I mean, final truth in Buddhism must be obtained by means of direct,
Mm.
non-conceptual, non-linguistic grasp of reality. No question about that. And that's what you need to achieve by way of meditation. And what kind of meditation? He calls it Hadu meditation. Hadu is a puzzle-like phrases that you can meditate on while doing sitting meditation, and then try to come up with ultimate truth. Because after all, reality is non-conceptual. So you come up with the ultimate truth by way of this puzzle-like statement, puzzle-like phrases. So that's the ultimate method they resort to. But he doesn't neglect, he doesn't denounce the careful study of the sutras, for example, the
Mm.
flower ornament sutra. For the initial awakening to the reality, we have to resort, we as a human being, as a fine human being, we have to resort to some sort of study of the sutras and stuff like that. But it only leads to initial awakening. The final,
So would this be something?
after you.
Would this be something a little bit like, Wittgenstein's ladder, where he talks at the end of the Tractatus about climbing these propositions being like the ladder that we climb up on, and once we're at the top and we can see how things really are, then we can throw the ladder away.
I never study Wittgenstein's analogy at the end of famous line from Tractatus carefully in
Mm.
comparison with Buddhism. I think it might be very relevant to tell the truth now that you're saying it. So, yes, you need to use the step on the ladder uh, to achieve a certain level of the vision of reality. But once you are uh, over it. Once you are done with it, you have to kick the letter away and then try to resort the non-conceptual means, which is nothing other than meditation. So that's the position that Chin offers. So I think analogy may be apposite in that regard.
There's a PhD thesis for somebody to write in there, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So I thought now we might turn to some particular terms, right? We're wanting to look at philosophy in the Korean language. And one of the terms that I was particularly interested in was the notion of mu, or of nothing. It's obviously a very important term in all kinds of Buddhist philosophy in its various languages. And it seemed that mu can be a sort of translation of the Sanskrit term of sunyata, or emptiness, right? And exists in a semantic field with many other particularly important terms for Korean philosophy. And so I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how this term is used, how it serves as a translation of earlier Buddhist ideas, um, and maybe how it's used in a particular philosophical context.
Yes, that's a very important question. The term mu or emptiness, the original Sanskrit term sunyata, as you point out, I think the germ of its idea can be found in Buddha himself, historical Buddha himself, but most uh, emphatically expressed in the philosophy of Majjhamaka, offered by Nagarjuna in India in the second century
Mm,
AD. And in that regard, the term should be understood as a kind of principle of causation, Buddhist causation. I mean, it's literally translated as original, dependent origination. You see what I mean? So nothing arises by self. Wherever there is a phenomenon,
mm.
it must arise because of the prior causes and conditions,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the present condition will give rise to a future phenomenon as well. So the whole world is a network of causes and contingent, and where you cannot find any permanent, fixed, self-independent entities. So nothing is completely um, independent of itself. It's a kind of a vision of reality as co-arising. So it represents a relational ontology as opposed to, I don't know, Cartesian substance ontology. You see what I mean? Descartes came with this idea of self as self-independent, abiding, permanent substance, um, but uh, that can exist without any properties, for example. But according to this Buddhist intuition, that's not the case. You see what I mean? Everything is interconnected in a web of uh, co-origination. Even
Mhm.
the Buddha mind that we are all familiar with is an expression of this continuous series of fleeting events. Uh, Nothing is forever, according to this intuition. We are all part of this uh, continuously flowing stream of reality. So it represents a relational ontology as opposed to substance ontology
Mhm.
prevalent in uh, Western metaphysics. Indeed, um, East Asian philosophy, not only Buddhism, but also Neo-Confucianism uh, uh, evolved out of this Buddhist intuition, influenced not exclusively, but also, but um,
Mhm.
um, develop it main um, notion, for example, the notion of principle Li under the influence of Buddhism. So you can see the importance of this idea all over in East Asian philosophical tradition.
Excellent. And when you say a relational ontology, you contrasted it already with the sort of Cartesian way of viewing things. So the idea there, to put it in very simple terms, might be something like, whereas an ontology of substance is one that thinks that there are different types of stuff which are out there in the world, and those things just happen to stand in particular relations to each other. Maybe the relation of being to the left of or to the right of, maybe in the relation of pausing, a cause and effect, that kind of relation, or the relation of being before or after. The idea is not so much in a relational ontology that you have stuff that stands in relate that happens to stand in relations, but that you have relations first and foremost, and that all of the stuff that kind of comes after. It's not like you have A and B and A is before B, but you have the relation of something being before and something being after, and only secondly, you have those other, the things that are related. Is that a fair description?
Excellent. I think you said it right, and then the idea is that you don't have entities or substances first. Entities or substances that can be divested of any properties, but and then enter into relations with each other and so on and so forth. But you have the you have
Hmm.
the you
Hmm.
have the relation. We have the relations first. Things in relation. Things that are not possible without already being in relation to each other. So this is expressed in the uh, East Asian tradition of emphasizing the community-oriented thought patterns as opposed to individual-oriented thought patterns in the West, for example. And then in Korean language, in terms of saying that my mother is so and so, my teacher, my pencil, sometimes my pet,
Hmm.
we say our. So for Koreans, we don't say my mother, we say our mother. So instead of saying my or I, we say our or us. So you can see that the language reflects this kind of relational
Hmm.
structure reality, because here our or uri in Korean represents a collective I. Collective I comes
Hmm.
before or prior to the individual I, and the individual I makes sense only in the context of community to which it belongs to as a web of uh, relations. So that's how the Korean traditional language reflects their vision of reality. We are nothing without the community to which we belong. So Korean ethical tradition or Korean spiritual tradition centered around this notion of um, togetherness, a close-knit community or society.
Fascinating. And it's so interesting how this general metaphysical picture of how things hang together, something as fundamental as an ontology of process or of relation versus an ontology of substance, can have this kind of parallel or have this reflection um, in grammar and in the grammar of social relations. That's a fascinating point, which is going to be really interesting to compare with some of the other interviews we've had, where we've had Professor Ochieng Odiambo talk about something similar in the case of Doluo in East African naming traditions and the like. But I wanted to come back before thinking about some of these very large scale comparisons to another school of thought that you mentioned earlier, which is a major player in the history of Korean philosophy, namely Neo-Confucianism. Now, you mentioned before in the case of Wonyo that he didn't see any important conflict between Buddhism and Taoist ideas that were coming from China. Was it any different in the case of Neo-Confucianist ideas? How did they sort of appear on the scene of Korean philosophy? Were they synthesized into this already, very diverse picture, or were these more of a conflict with existing ideas?
Philosophically, I think Neo-Confucianism is a outcome of a very active, dynamic interaction between many schools of thought, including Buddhism, Taoism, and classical Confucianism of Confucius and Mencius and those classical figures. Um, but fundamental insight
Hmm.
offered by Neo-Confucianism is the view that the whole world is an expression of the underlying principle of Li, and then this Li permeates all things in the universe, sort of a universal, if I may borrow the Western philosophical jargon, and that is exemplified in the different things in the world. So we human beings have our own principle, human nature, and animals have their own
Hmm.
nature, animal nature, um, and so on and so forth. And the ultimate principle governing the whole um, universe is sometimes called uh, taiji or taeguk in Korean. So that's sometimes translates supreme ultimate. So we can say that supreme ultimate is a grand mother of all principles governing the whole universe, and then these are exemplified in different things in nature. It's a cosmic principle governs the whole universe, but also it's a ethical principle that governs the relationship among human beings. So the Confucian traditional virtues of filial piety or righteousness or humanity are all expression of this fundamental principle
Hmm.
um, in the context of human society, of course. So it's a metaphysically originally syncretic, but politically, uh, the last traditional dynasty of Joseon in Korean Peninsula arose in opposition to Buddhism because
Hmm.
political ideology-wise, they had to remove Buddhism as a political ideology to replace its political system with a new ideology of Neo Confucianism. So Buddhism was highly suppressed in the last dynasty in Korean Buddhism during the Joseon Joseon. So political philosophy-wise, ideology-wise, Neo-Confucianism suppressed Buddhism very seriously, very heavily, very cruel. But philosophically, it was already an outcome of, say, synthesis among different trends of philosophical thought by way of its origin.
Well, that's fascinating how you can have two philosophical schemes which, on the pure abstract realm of ideas can seem to be such an interesting fit that can speak to each other so well. And yet in the political realm, the realm of ideology and stuff can conflict so seriously. I was interested by a point that you'd made when you were talking about when you were trying to outline the basic metaphysics of Neo-Confucianism. You mentioned that using the term universal was a way of sort of imposing a Western jargon on these ideas. And I wonder sort of how is the term universal, if we just take this specific term, how is the term universal somehow kind of inadequate to do that, right? So how is how is using a term like universal, or maybe if there's another example that you prefer of a Western term which is kind of distorting a particular understanding of some of the ideas that we've spoken about today?
Absolutely. It's a very um, um, potentially dangerous idea to make use of Western concept to explain um, mm, Eastern philosophical ideas. So there's that risk. But uh, if you are familiar with Western terms such as universals or substance, perhaps you can uh, take advantage of them and then try to explain with the proviso that ultimately analogy may break down. But the case the case is um, the same with the principle as opposed to the material. So it's a uh, principle of Li that is the kind of uh, ultimate norm of the universe as well as the society. But it can be exemplified in various ways uh, because of the its interaction with material force, which we
Mm.
happen to call
Hmm.
Ki
Hmm.
in Korean and Chi in Chinese, a famous Chi, you see what I mean? So Chi is fundamentally particularizing forces that provide the material aspect of things or relations, but underlying this material aspect lies the immaterial or cosmic principle of Li. That's the basic idea of Neo-Confucianism. So we human beings also exemplify this different ratio of Li and Qi, and so that's the basic intuition. But we don't want to say that this principle is exactly like Aristotelian or form or Plato's eidos. It's more of a complementary element. The relation between Li and Qi, to tell the truth, complementary, not opposed. You know what I mean? It's not the relation between eidos and the prime matter in the case of Aristotle. It's more complementary. So the reality and the manifested world of phenomenon are not two, but two different expressions. It's more complementary, not opposed. That's the basic insight among the East Asian philosophers, especially Korean philosophers.
That's fascinating. And it's interesting, again, I think one of the big purposes of doing these interviews on philosophy in languages that are less often studied as vehicles of philosophy is that instead of always having to interpret the Korean philosophical term, say, in terms of a term like universal or metaphysics or whatever that might be, we might have the opportunity to try and explain some of the concepts we're much more familiar with in terms of less familiar concepts like the ones that you've introduced to us today, so that we potentially get a really fruitful sort of cross-reading of these different ideas. But in the time that we have left, I would like to sort of bring our story almost up to date, to think about philosophy in modern Korea. I know it's a really difficult task to do a millennia and a half of philosophy in only the 45 minutes or so that we have. But I was very interested by a couple of different aspects in the history of philosophy in Korea in the late 19th and early 20th century. One of these being the suggestions of a female Korean philosopher, the Buddhist nun Kim Il-yop, and her idea of the new woman. Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, absolutely, absolutely. During the traditional Korea, women were highly oppressed and then occupy an inferior position in society. Not necessarily because of Neo-Confucian framework. We can find the excellent, eminent Neo-Confucian women philosophers even during the height of the Joseon period, and then people are really excavating the ideas of these excellent women philosophers. But in general, the status of women in society was very low during the Joseon dynasty. Kim Il-yop was a main force or impetus behind this movement, basically a feminist movement in modern Korea, trying to reform the society. So her view of the woman was that the woman has the full potentiality to realize her internal resources in the community and in society, and she can recognize this kind of equal power in everybody else. So that's the conception of new woman that she came up with, and she even issued or published a journal called New Woman, 신여자. So that we can observe in the first part of the 20th century. So the self-promoted a radical radically new conception of love among women, and also as opposed to the arranged marriage found in the traditional society. And then when she grew up as a Christian, she was a member of a Christian family, but she later converted to Buddhism and came up with the idea of new woman under the influence of Buddhist notion of self, namely self is
Ah,
nothing other than the conjury or the um, system of potentialities, which can be realized fully to the its full extent, you know, um, activities in the society, and which she did. She was a active member of the Buddhist order and writer uh, of important philosophical essays. So uh, she was a pioneer in that regard, and then marks the beginning of feminist movement in Korea.
Fascinating. And it's so interesting that you mentioned that she was born a Christian and converted to Buddhism, because the last sort of set of ideas I wanted to ask you about were the synthesis led by Tasok. Is that the title? Um,
That's right. Tasok was a pen name. That's right.
Aha, because from what I understand, Tasok is this fascinating attempt to kind of blend traditions by identifying the aforementioned notion that we had of Mu or of nothingness with the Abrahamic God. Now, how did this work, and what were the kind of motivations for developing this sort of theory?
Aha. That's a very interesting question. Tasok, his original family was Liu, and first name was Youngmo. But Tasok is a pen name. So traditional Korean philosophers usually went by their pen name. So so Tasok is a pen name of this philosopher. He was born and raised as Confucian, but later converted to Christianity. But it's a highly uh, indigenized, highly Koreanized form of Christianity to tell the truth, because he understood the Abrahamic God or Yahweh uh, rather by means of the traditional notion of, I would say, heaven, as I said before. He has a notion of the this conception of absolute being, but this being was not the kind of Thomistic God of absolute independence. Rather, it's an immanent God in us and among us. So paradoxically, he names it non-existing existing being, 없이계시니. So, and that's how he conceived this very special being as a source of life, as a social of, as a source of creation in the world. So, there's no question he started as a Christian, but it's a highly Koreanized version in immanent conception of God. As I said, you can say that it's a panentheistic notion of God, so to speak, as opposed to the notion of God as the absolute other, a absolute transcendent God that is absolutely separate from the rest of the world. No, that's not the kind of God that he espoused, but rather he wanted to utilize traditional concept of mu, namely nothingness, and then incorporate it into the nature of God as a ineffable source of creation and being in the world. So that's how we came up with the notion of non-existing existing God.
Well, it's fascinating then. If the first particular figure we spoke about was Huanyo with this incredible synthesis of so many different Buddhist ideas with Taoism, all into one sort of conceptual whole, 1,300 years later, we have somebody who's able to synthesize, build not only on these earlier syntheses, not only on syntheses with Neo-Confucian ideas, but including the Abrahamic faiths in one as well. So it's such a spectacular story as well, in that from what we've spoken about, at least, and obviously we've only been able to cover a tiny fraction of the tradition of Korean philosophy. But one thing that's really characterized it has not so much been the sort of splintering of different schools into arguing each other and into turning off into radically different ideas, but constantly in the attempt to integrate various different philosophical ideas into a unified whole. Do you think that seems like a fair characterization of Korean philosophy in general, or are these the particular figures we've picked?
I think that's a very fair observation as far as Korean philosophical geography is concerned. They not opposed to foreign ideas, but rather willing to incorporate foreign ideas and then transform this uh, heterogeneous element into their own tradition and heritage. If you visit Buddhist temple in Korea, yes, there is a main worship hall, there is a hall of medicine Buddha, but always uh,
Mhm.
the hall of you can find easily find a hall of a pavilion of shaman gods. I mean, Buddhist temple accepted this um, uh, shaman gods into their
Mm.
uh, temple and then worship them quite explicitly. So you can see that they wanted to compromise with the native tradition, even though Buddhism originated from foreign countries, and then come up with a unified whole without rejecting the different element. I think the same is true uh, in the case of Confucianism, at least Koreanized form of Confucianism. They, um, uh, I think they retain the uh, elements of shamanism and also Buddhism. As I point out, the fundamental notion of Li originates from the Buddhist notion of Li, which was developed in Huayan Buddhism in Tang China, for example, Sui and Tang China, for example. So there's this syncretic element, synthetic element, and the same is true of Korean Christianity as well, because uh, among the Korean Christian pastors, you see the same function that they perform, just like ancient shamans. You see what I mean? Healing, prayer for the worldly needs, the uh, funeral services by way of sending off their deadly ones in funeral services and stuff like that. These all elements that uh, helped Christianity find their way into Korean society. As I said, Korean society highly spiritual society. I would say about 25% of them are Christians. I would say 25% of them are Buddhists. Others shamanistic, and also non-believers. In North Korea, you can find the Marxists and Leninists, but you know what? 100% of them are Confucian. You see what I mean? So there's a there's a there's a highly family-oriented society, community-oriented society, and then very relational community-oriented society where your relation with others may be compared to father-son relation. God, even God is conceived as a kind of father, and we are conceived as children of God in this scheme of things. And in North Korean society, the dictator leader is conceived as a father figure. You see what I mean? It's a even at
Mhm.
the level of personal cult. You see what I mean? So you can see that they're trying to make use of the Confucian uh, scheme of things, even at the level of politics. And that's how they manage to
Yeah.
maintain society despite the economic hardship and the international pressure on them. So, but that's a different subject, of course.
Absolutely. And I think there are so many of those different subjects that we would have been able to pick up and run with. I think maybe we'll have to do a Korean philosophy part two that goes over all of these figures that we didn't see. But I think
Really.
I'd like to conclude sort of by thinking that what you've just told us about the incredible sort of synthesis of these different philosophical traditions just within Korea. I think it really serves as such a lovely example of what we're trying to do with all of these series, with the synthesis of different philosophical ideas around the world in a modern academy, in the sense that so much of the contemporary work we do can be work in English from a very narrow, very small set of philosophical traditions. And that if we don't have this openness that Korean philosophy has traditionally showed to translation, to synthesis, to eclecticism, to syncretism, then we really end up losing a lot. So much of what you've told me today has been so fascinating because of the creative incorporation, the indigenization of what were initially foreign ideas. And I would hope perhaps that philosophers listening to this in America or the UK can start to do something similar with their own philosophy, with the Korean ideas you've suggested to us.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to say thank you very much to Professor Hala Kim, and you've been listening to Philosophizing In.
Thank you.